everyone. I'm Sandy Robinson, your host of RevOps Unboxed, and I am so excited today. I'm here with Anne Pao, who is the Fractional RevOps Executive and CRO, CEO and founder of Ignite Consulting. I'm super excited for this conversation, Anne. Thanks for joining me today, and I'd love for you to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself.
Great. Thanks so much, Sandy. And I'm thrilled to be here. I'm a big fan of you and kind of what you do on LinkedIn and what you post and share. I'm Anne Pao. Like I said, I run Ignite Consulting. It's a solopreneurship, fractional RevOps executive, CRO services to seed stage startups all the way through to public companies. Prior to this, for 20 plus years, I was an in-house RevOps executive, revenue leader, starting my career in finance, really morphing into operations, analytics, and then revenue operations. And I did that in, large public companies, private companies, startups, both in the US and Africa.
Wow. That is quite a journey. That sounds very, very interesting. Can you tell me a little bit about just the whole concept of being a fractional RevOps executive?
Sure. And so I think, first of all, we might have seen, some of you might have seen that in 2023, RevOps was like the fastest growing head of RevOps career or job title globally. And if I did a search back then, it was like 5,000 people had hits of RevOps in their title and over 2,500 in the US. But this fractional thing kind of has really emerged as like a term. And I've been doing it for the last year and a half. There are people doing it longer, but I think it's kind of created a surge in the last year and a half or two, even from the time that I launched. What's interesting is there's fractional, there's freelance, there's contractor. Like, what's the difference? There's interim. What's the difference, right? When I think about fractional RevOps, what makes it different than a contract role or than a part-time or an interim role is you're getting kind of, yes, this executive or very experienced leader person to come in for, yes, a fraction of their time, but it's very focused. And the goal of that is, well, this has been somebody who has kind of seen the story multiple times. So you're able to tap into very, very experienced leadership for a fraction of the cost and have them very focused, help you accelerate. That's my definition and how it might be different than just being like a contract RevOps person. And so I think it has to do a lot with the level of experience somebody brings, that experience set across lots of different scenarios. And now they've kind of gone out and they're able to do it across a multitude of different clients at one time.
For sure. And I think sometimes, startups, they really want to bring in RevOps, but trying to bring in a full-time RevOps leader at a Series A or Series B is kind of far-fetched, I think.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a reason why, when I was a head of RevOps, I was always recruited in generally Series C, D. And by that point, you have a lot more cash. These companies generally had anywhere from, 150 people to maybe 300 or more. And really, like, the pain of not having a full-time RevOps leader was really hitting them in their areas of both growth and retention. But when you think about it, coming in seed stage, Series A, I mean, if you're a head of RevOps, that could be anything at, sometimes it's a senior manager director level all the way up to a VP. And when you get into kind of this senior director VP level role, your total OTE might be $300,000 to $400,000. That's a lot of cash out the gate, right? And it heavily, as opposed to maybe a sales leader where it's much more maybe like a 50-50 or 60-40, it's a lower percentage of variable. So it's high base salary you're paying, and that's just headcount related costs, not in addition to all the non-headcount related. So it can be very cost prohibitive, which is why so many people wait.
Right. It could be 3 or 4, SDRs or, AE positions, rather than, one senior RevOps head. So makes a lot of sense what you're doing. I mean, there's a lot of advantages for sure. So as you're working with all of these different companies, and, I know you're involved in different groups and boards, and you do so many things. What trends are you seeing out there in RevOps that you think people should be focusing on?
Yeah, it's also a great question. I mean, one of the kind of trends and why I think RevOps obviously emerged was, we know this, there was sales ops and there was marketing ops. And then now this new thing called RevOps kind of gained a lot of traction and popularity, probably around, I think like 2019 is when I first started hearing it, like kind of hit the press. Yeah. So obviously that consolidation, something new that I'm starting to witness being a little bit more common, and I'm excited about it, is, a lot of RevOps that I see is very much like systems or operational functions, but it's becoming much more of a strategic function, much more part of the executive team, which is where I think it should be. It is also not just only reporting into the, it often reports into the CRO. I've reported into like
Hmm.
several CROs, 7 or 8, not because I worked at 7 or 8 companies, but because of the tenure of a CRO.
Right.
But now what I'm starting to see is this emerging trend of RevOps reporting into the CEO or the CFO. I've reported into both.
Hmm.
There are strong opinions about reporting into CFOs under RevOps. I think in times it can make a lot of sense. It depends on the CFO leader. So that's one trend. Another trend that I'm seeing is, especially in this age of AI that we're in, which is still like the infancy stage, let's be honest, some RevOps is becoming so critical because typically that team has been the one that's been implementing the go-to-market technology, that's been implementing the workflows and the processes. So now you have executive leaders that are like, how do we actually think about AI embedding into our business, not just to support our customer, but internally? And I think RevOps is well positioned to advise on that because they're the ones that really are understanding all of those connective processes, as well as like an understanding of the systems integration landscape, maybe better than anyone else if they don't, for example, have an enterprise systems team. And even if they have
Hmm.
that, it's not just about the team, the systems and integration. It's about like, how are we actually optimizing how our teams work? And I think RevOps is constantly, if you have a strong RevOps team, really thinking about that.
Right, because there's the people factor too. So you're going between teams, different people that are, handling different parts of the buying journey, and then the systems and then the process. And you're right. I mean, that's my world. I'm constantly going back and forth between, operations and, all the different teams, even if they're not under my CRO. So that makes so much sense. And it's, I think IT teams or enterprise systems teams, they're thinking about security and, just kind of the basics, the bones of how things work, but not really the reality of the user experience, the internal user.
Yes. And they can be a bit disconnected from it, just sometimes in the ways of organizational structure. Like I reported into a CIO org that was enterprise systems, that luckily I was the head of BI in this team. I was BI and systems integration and kind of like
Okay.
emerged as RevOps before RevOps was a thing. But that
Yep.
was because I had a very growth minded CIO who said, no, we need to be very embedded in the business, but that's not always the case. Right.
Yeah, definitely. And then depending on what the C-suite looks like, what's your perspective in companies where, there's a CMO and a CRO, right? So I've seen that in the world, or because then you're kind of you're mashing up these, marketing ops, sales ops, customer success ops, and everything. So, what kinds of challenges have you seen there?
Oh gosh, where do we begin, Candy?
Yeah.
Why don't I talk about one that went not well and then
Okay.
one that went really well, or maybe not well, but like that was very challenging, right?
Yeah.
So I was in an organization, it was probably like about a series, was it a series C or D? Anyways, doesn't matter. 100, there's 70 million maybe of funding, 200, 250 people. I was reporting into the CRO. I was hired in to be the VP of Revenue Operations and Strategy, which in my interview process was, you will own sales ops and CS ops and marketing ops and enablement. And then I got in there the day of, do your homework in your interviews, make sure you're hearing all the same story. And they're like, actually, just kidding. Marketing ops is over here.
Yes.
And actually, enablement's over here. And actually, they're not reporting to you. Maybe we want that to happen. Why did this occur? The
Right.
CRO had not talked to the CMO, had
Mhm.
sold this vision, and then, of course, this blew up. So I think this is, and that was a very painful experience
Mhm.
because we were fractious as a result. There was opposition. It really illuminated the division between, in my mind, the CRO and the CMO.
Mhm.
And so I'd seen this story before. I immediately within a week was like, oh, this is going to be a fun one. And I raised it to the CEO and I was like, we need to solve for this because if you really want my role to align the go to market, like I can do that, but we're going to go through a lot more pain if you don't hold these leaders accountable. And I don't care who I report to. Even if I report to the CRO, I still see my job is to represent the company. My job is to
Mhm.
represent the go to market. That person is just there for like my performance reviews.
Mhm.
And I mean, you might know this because we engage on LinkedIn. I'm not afraid to like say the thing. I mean, there
Yeah.
are some leaders, and I've worked with some CMOs that say, well, Anne, if you report to the CRO, how do I know that you're going to represent this? How do I know that you're going to challenge the CRO? I'm like, well, you don't know me, but I will challenge all of you. I'll challenge the CEO. That's
Right.
not always the case, though. So I understand that fear and that
Mm-hmm.
concern because it really depends on the leader. I've been
Mm-hmm.
lucky, though, now coming to what good looked like. So that one was just like a dumpster fire, right? Half of
Right.
my
Right.
time spent like managing and negotiating back and forth between CMO and CRO because there was like a chasm.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One of the other ones that was a much stronger story was in an organization where actually when I began, I was like VP of field operations. So I looked after
Mm-hmm.
sales ops, CS ops, and enablement, and marketing ops sat separately. And I was noticing that there was just a little bit more duplicity. I was noticing that we could have moved faster and more efficiently if we unified the functions, not because I needed to have a fempire, female empire,
Oh, I
but
love
just for
that.
like to support the business. And but the business was not ready for that yet.
Mm.
And the CMO, who was actually our chief commercial officer, who looked after marketing and product, was resistant because he's like, well, can I trust Anne? Is she going to represent my interests? Well, what ended up happening is I planted that seed. This was right when RevOps was becoming a thing, and I was like, this is the new way of work. This is what I think we need to do. Here's how I think it's going to benefit the business, and I presented it to the C suites. They weren't ready for it yet, so I'm like, okay, we'll just wait. And as we waited, the pain started to build. And then COVID happened and there were layoffs. And as a result, we
Mm.
didn't have a VP of marketing anymore. And they were like,
Mm.
whoa, Fred, what are we going to do with all these teams? Okay, now maybe is the time that we're going to unify it under Anne and make her, overall RevOps. I actually called it BizOps because they also put product ops underneath there. Very quickly, we started to see the machine start to accelerate,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that was what the team members needed to see, the executive members needed to see. I then moved up and became an executive at this company to say, wait a minute, centralization when coordinated, and really we have one team that is beholden to across all of the pillars of go-to-market leadership is the way to go. And they were like, we're going to double down here. They moved
Mm.
sales development over there. They moved pre-sales. Anything that was kind of in between two teams or two different parts of the funnel, they were like, we need to nest within one org that's going to hold all of us accountable. And as a result of that, literally within the quarter, 2 quarters following, from an SDR perspective, conversion perspective, we improved our conversion from SL through to SQL by 5 percentage points. From an
Wow.
overall net revenue retention target perspective, we were 250% to target. Was this the only thing that happened? No, there were many other optimizations, but this was a crucial choice that was made by the executive team, and then the results supported it.
Yeah, that's so important that, I know everybody talks about alignment and everything, but having true alignment, it's challenging to do without the reporting structure to support it. So we can work together and collaborate, and that's, when I talk to folks, at conferences or on LinkedIn about, how do I work with this person, or, enablement's over here and I'm in RevOps, how do I get enablement to work with me, or how do I get marketing to work with me? And obviously there's a lot of people skills involved, required, but it makes it so much easier when it comes from the top, and the reporting structure, supports that, more officially, because it just removes the friction, I think. And everybody is always going to be worried about their jobs, right? So if there is a marketing ops that is not in one place, then I think it's the challenge is just making sure you can partner together, because there are things that are, depending on your role in the organization. If I'm a new analyst, or I'm aspiring RevOps leader, how do I help and make an impact, and communicate, and make some of those, build some of those bridges.
Yeah, and one other thing, as you were speaking, Sandy, I was thinking back on that time, and it was, yes, we had to come at it from the top to have real alignment and like
Hmm.
vision across the go to market, and that really needed to come
Hmm.
from the CEO, right?
Yeah.
But in addition, we also came from the bottom because like I don't want to take
Hmm.
a team. They're like, oh, who's this person? Is she going to understand what we
Right.
do? So there was also like a bottom grassroots advocacy that has to be done. And what I found, I started in data analytics in sales ops. Yes, I supported like marketing analytics in the past, but my roots were not in marketing ops. So
Hmm.
what was really important to get closer to really get closer to what those teams were struggling with, what that they were doing. I've mentored demand generation leaders. I've mentored marketing ops leaders, really understanding like the specifics of the work of what they do, so you can go down to a level of depth and build credibility and then accurately represent their pain. Really
Mm-hmm.
key in building trust. The other thing that I'll add is, I remember when this change happened, there was this just tireless, hardworking woman who was our marketing ops person, and she was working probably 80 to 90 hours a week. And
Oh
nobody
gosh.
knew. And she was just like a workhorse and wouldn't complain. And I got in there and got closer to her and I said, okay, let's talk about what you're doing. And then when I realized, wait, you can't be working that. Like, you're going to burn out. This is not sustainable. Like,
Yeah.
we might have pushes where we got to work 60. I don't want that to be the norm. And so
Right.
there was also suddenly, by bringing her into the fold of RevOps and then building out our roadmap of what are we doing, our weekly sprints of what's happening across the team, where are we prioritizing our time and integrating that, suddenly she had a conduit up to the top that was,
Mm.
what is this individual working on? How critical is that? What are things that could go to others in the revenue operations team to take off her plate so she is not so
Mm-hmm.
overburdened? And that really helped her, just from like a longevity and being a staff member and impact that would not have happened had she not been part of a centralized team, as opposed to off here in a silo, nobody really knowing what she did. Even her old
Mm-hmm.
boss, the VP of marketing, was not involved. He just was like, you just go and figure it out, and just kept piling on work,
Right.
to actually operating as a full team.
Right, right. And so not only is there the burnout factor in her potentially leaving, but that could leave a huge hole in the organization as well, as she did, because then nobody knows what to do, right? That makes so much sense, and I like how you talked about understanding her pain. I mean, I think I'm a salesperson at heart, so I got my start in sales, like hustling Yellow Pages advertising, actually in your neck of the woods, and it was so you apply your internal selling skills, right? So I think being a RevOps leader, you have to be a salesperson, and you have to be a salesperson internally, understand their pains, understand what's happening, and really understand their process, I think, in building those relationships from the bottom. Because I think most of us need to do that, because not everybody's in the perfect world where the C-suite on day one is going to understand, like, how important bringing systems together, or even things like, let's all get on one communication channel. Why is half of the organization using Slack and the other half of the organization using GChat? And I've been told on those things before, well, stay in your lane. That's not your lane. It's like, well, dude, it is kind of my lane, because if we're not communicating properly with other departments, then how are we able to support all of those handoffs, and it just creates additional internal friction, and all those things that come with it, all the downstream impacts.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So so when you think about marketing ops, sales ops, CS ops, there's a lot of talk around you know go to market operations and this emerging, and I think there's a lot of um, I don't want to use the term crossover, but there is a lot, right? From, you think of revenue operations and go to market operations, and obviously different companies that are product led, may have different needs. So, what is your general thinking around the go to market operations function, and that starting to really trend out there? I think that's going to be the next Forbes most posted position, like RevOps was 5 years ago.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, when I think back on the roles and titles that I have had in this
Mm-hmm.
space, I've been in commercial operations, which was
Mm-hmm.
sales and marketing, and then there was market research. I've been in business operations. Really,
Mm-hmm.
the reason they called it business operations was because I reported to the CFO. So they didn't want to call it revenue operations. But in that world, I ran go to market analytics. I ran
Yep.
sales ops, CS ops, marketing ops, enablement, pre sales, sales development, product ops.
Yep.
They just didn't know what to call it. They're like, just call it this, right? Okay,
Call it
fine.
something. Yep.
I have never had go to market ops, even though I think people, a lot of the times, what I'm doing, refer to it as such.
Mm-hmm.
I actually don't really care what they call it. Part
Yeah.
of why I think people are calling it something different is because, and I know it's more for when the leaders that I see using go to market operations are generally more senior in their tenure,
Mm-hmm.
more
Mm-hmm.
experience in terms of the number of times that they have been leading these types of functions, very, very cross disciplinary. And they're
Mm-hmm.
trying to, I think, elevate and differentiate it from what RevOps has started to become, which is,
Mm-hmm.
you can be part of a RevOps team. As we know, as you know, there are all the different functions. You could be a Salesforce architect who is part of RevOps.
Mm-hmm.
You could be
Yep.
maybe an SDR who, if sales development house, who is part of RevOps. You can be, a marketing ops person that is part of RevOps, all of these things. And so I think people are trying to up level it a little bit from it being adopted and becoming more mainstream to kind of differentiate themselves. So I think it actually, maybe it's a hot take. I think it has a little bit of selfish roots of like, that's not me. I'm different. I'm up here doing
Right.
all other
Yeah.
things. I mean, I'd be curious what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of from the same mindset. I think it really depends on the organization and maybe even the stage and what the focus is. If you're constantly launching new products and and you have this really aggressive go to market, then it may warrant having something specifically focused on that. But I agree. I mean, generally speaking, uh, I think outside of the strategy, so you start to potentially get into the actual product strategy and how are you going to market. So I think that may be the differentiating factor. But I agree. It's all a title. So that's why I tell people when they ask me, well, I'm interviewing for this job. How should I prepare? And it's like, well, the title's one thing, but what does the job description say? Like what are you actually owning in this job and managing or collaborating with? What are the deliverables? Because even RevOps jobs, probably half of them are sales ops,
Sales
or
ops
they're
or systems. I see a lot of people who are
systems.
systems people who are like, I'm a head of RevOps. I'm like, you've never
Hmm.
run strategy. You never like,
Right.
I would disagree, right? Unless
Right.
your RevOps team is focused purely on systems because you're in that infancy.
Right.
But I think your point around
Right.
product strategy is a good one because, like I said, I've run product ops teams, but what goes
Hmm.
into the launch of a product, I've run new packages. But then, like, are we
Hmm.
going to just start to pull all of it? It is product marketing. At what point do we stop? Right? At what point do we
Yeah.
stop
Yeah.
expanding it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think at some point, it's like people wanting to get more span of control. I mean, you have to know, like, you're always dealing with a human at the other end of it, and what they're, everybody, if you're working for another organization, you do have a job. So everybody, at some level is worried about their own positions, even if they're not outwardly concerned about it or they're not operating that way. People need to pay the bills. And so I think there's some of that. But yeah, I'm not big on labels, but it's definitely out there in the world, and I see a lot of posts
It
on it.
is. It is. And people are still trying to figure it out. And when people tell me, and I'm a head of RevOps, or and
Hmm.
we're hiring a head of RevOps. Can you help us with this search? I'm like, well, tell me
Hmm.
what RevOps means to you in your organization. Tell me what the
Right.
organizations are. Tell me what problems you're trying to solve. And that's going to help elucidate what they're really looking for. Maybe they don't actually
Right.
need a head of RevOps. Maybe they just need a head of marketing ops,
Right.
So I think
Right.
getting into the specifics really, really key to kind of elucidate what the role is and what's required and what will go into that span of control, as you were saying.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think another big piece of it when you're looking at RevOps is
Mm-hmm.
compensation. How are you looking at, sales compensation, commissions
Yes.
plans, SDR
Yes.
compensation, what do those plans look like?
Great point. And
Um,
sometimes like I've nested that. I always have like these are like, my 7 or 8 pillars of what I've said is RevOps.
mhm,
And compensation planning is one of them. Sometimes people like to
mhm,
put that in, well, that's part of my strategy, right? But I'm like, no, it's compensation planning. But then, there was just a conversation today in the pavilion group that I'm in, and somebody asked, hey, talk to us about what you think. There was a thread on like where commissions should sit. And I'm like, oh,
mm,
interesting. Like, how does this work with sales finance or finance and ops? And I just said, here's what I've typically seen. It's very much shared. And when they were talking about
mhm,
commission, they meant overall comp planning and maybe commission administration. But that's something
mhm.
where like I think parts of it do have to be shared for governance,
Right.
right? So like I don't know
Yes.
about you, but like for me in roles where I've led RevOps, we owned comp plan design. By the way, finance does not want to
Hmm.
own comp plan design. They're like, please.
No, they
We
don't.
are so far from that. We're like, we don't know what motivates them. I've had VPs of finance be like, why does it matter if we're paying on, cash receipts, book date? It's all the same. I'm like, not to the rep, not how you incent. Absolutely not.
Yeah.
And so comp plan
Right.
design, communication, stakeholder engagement around the design, rollout, tracking in terms of obviously attainment, all RevOps, and also approval
Hmm.
cycles of the plan, signature, and then usually validation from finance saying, hey, we ran this report, this is what we're going to pay. Is this right?
Hmm.
RevOps do
Yeah.
that. But
Yep.
actually, execution of that payment, calculations, finance. I don't want anything to do with that. I want them to, they're
Right.
doing payroll. That's how people get paid. I shouldn't be touching that.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. Having the checks and balance. And I've come into two organizations in the past, and it was like the sales manager was putting everything in the spreadsheet, self-approving and approving their own,
Oh,
their own. I'm like, dude, like,
awkward.
you know, I don't, yeah, awkward. I don't know. This is a great thing, but yeah, having the governance on that is important, and finding understanding I think only really RevOps or somebody that understands the sales cycle and what the salespeople are motivated by are going to be able to really build out those plans. But like we have I constructed a plan when I came over to Patra, and we use a tool now because I did not want to deal with spreadsheets. That's the one thing I don't want to mess
Yes,
up. So that's the one thing I'm
very
going to go
smart.
get a tool
Very
for right
smart.
away.
Mhm.
And built out a multi-level approval system, some checks and balances. Yeah, and then it goes to
Yep.
finance, and they cut the checks, and they deal with all
Yep.
that. Yeah, those are important pieces, I think, when you look at. So you said you have 7 or 8 pillars. So your compensation planning. What were your other pillars of
Oh
RevOps?
gosh, let me see if I can recite them from scratch. So there's kind of like there's like the strategy aspect. So this is where like all your planning will go into your setting of your go-to-market targets, your customer methodology. Notice that I said customer methodology. It's not just
Mm-hmm.
a sales methodology. It's full funnel. It really needs to govern all of that. I mean, I remember when we rolled this out, someone from finance actually brought this up. They're like, we should be thinking about this methodology in terms of how we're writing our contracts as well. I'm like, wow, that person gets it. Yes. So
Mm-hmm.
your TAM, SAM, your segmentation. I mean, operations broad, but I think of like core operations, like your operating cadence, your forecasting, your pipeline reviews, your renewal forecasting, all those things kind of embedding. Enablement has been a really, really core pillar. And within enablement, it's not just training. I have used
Mm-hmm.
my heads of enablement as being like the core conduit of communication between the go-to-market teams. And I think that's like critical so that we have one single conduit. They're also responsible for knowledge management and also kind of like the cadence of like go-to-market briefings. How do we keep everybody aware of what's happening from like what we've developed from a product perspective, how that translates through the messaging, thank you product marketing, and then how we enable the teams and kind of going back
Mm-hmm.
and forth. So enablement's a pillar. We've discussed compensation planning. Again, if you have sales development or business development as part of RevOps, that can be its own pillar as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that can sit there. And I'm also one pillar. I mean, I don't want to call it PMO because then people get antsy, like, why is PMO and RevOps? But I am a deep believer that RevOps, go to market ops, whatever you want to call it, a key differentiator for what a strong practitioner looks like has a very strong project management mindset.
Mm-hmm.
Really thinking through how do I launch initiatives, how do I get them over the line. um, I think you were maybe asking me in like the prep, what's a mantra that you said, a
Mm-hmm.
RevOps
Mm-hmm.
mantra. And one thing that I've told my team is you don't get a prize for getting to the 3 yard line. You got to
Yeah.
get over that line, right?
Yeah.
So many times like you do all this work and then it just drops and you forget about it because you get busy. We
Mm-hmm.
execute, complete, and we deliver, right? And
Right.
so get over the 3 yard line, get over the
Yeah.
finish line. If you're a sports fan, like get the touchdown, whatever. I think that's really key. And so much of that comes back to project management, but also within that stakeholder management, keeping
Mm-hmm.
everybody on the same page. And then the last pillar is really your data and analytics. And that can be anything
Yes.
from data and analytics. Systems could go there. Sometimes it's separate. It really depends. Your systems architecture. Obviously, like I think that having a very, very strong go to market systems foundation, especially in the day that we're and age that we're in, such a differentiator. How many times have I gone in and they're like, oh, we turned somebody into an admin, and they're a
Mm-mm.
Salesforce admin who just like builds and builds and builds and builds, but
Mm.
doesn't think about architecture, has no idea how to engage stakeholders, doesn't think about
Yep.
UX. That's going to create a lot of pain for your organization.
That is such a huge point, because that's how you get all the duct tape and band-aids, right? Because admins, phenomenal, but sometimes if you're not thinking about the bigger picture, the role that I have and had in my prior org, hired for, is a head of rev tech architect, essentially. So it's, the if whether you're a Salesforce, HubSpot, or whatever shop, that's their core foundation, but they need to have the ability to understand how all the integrations work, you don't want to get, loops and, duplicate information and things breaking. So you want somebody to be thinking strategically about how to set up the technology and how to, in a lot of cases, reduce the technology and make it work and get rid of those Frankenstacks, that are out there.
So many.
I
We've all
know.
been there, right? Like the
Hmm.
number of times, Sandy, I've gone into an organization, and yes, I've come from more, I was part of enterprise systems. I was with Medallia when we went from 100 to 350 million. They IPO'd. We had like several hundred applications, and I remember seeing that systems architecture
Mm.
landscape map. It was heavy. But
Hmm.
when I go into an organization, that's not even, seed or A. I mean, these are BC organizations. And I'm
Hmm.
like, hey, where's your go-to-market systems landscape roadmap? And they go, oh, we have a list of 5 apps that we use. I'm like, no, 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 that's not what I'm asking for. I'm like, great, but there's a lot more apps. Or
Right.
they're like, okay, fine, you don't have a systems architecture landscape map. You don't understand the flows. Fine, we can work on that. Has anybody done an audit of the systems? Oh yeah, it lives in like these 8. Well, marketing has one, and sales has one, and CS has one. So literally, I'll go and I'll be like, we're having one go-to-market systems audit, and I
Hmm.
collaborate, work with all the functional teams, even if they don't report into me at first, like that one where
Hmm.
they're like, marketing ops actually sits over here. And then we look for the duplicity, and we look for, why do we still have this? Maybe the person who, we didn't even know we had it. This is why companies like
Hmm.
Tropic and Productive exist. Right? We're going to
Hmm.
unearth all this like shadow IT tech. It's not to necessarily control all of it, but sometimes you don't know, and
Right.
then you don't have. Then you're like, I can't hire a RevOps analyst, but you're paying for all this tech that if you just got rid of like
Yeah.
3 things that no one's using, it would probably fund that analyst
Yeah.
salary,
Yeah.
right? And so it's such like a low hanging fruit, and nobody was accountable to doing it in a centralized way because they didn't have a head of RevOps.
Yep. Yeah, and it gets out of control so quickly from, Series A to B to C. You have head of marketing. Well, I'm going to grab this tool, and then it's a free. Then it becomes a team. Then soon it becomes an enterprise, and now you're stuck with that one. And then they hired a head of sales, and they got this tool, and they're not. So it happens. I've seen it happen so quickly. But I think anybody, no matter what level you are, if you approach it, in the right way, can ask those questions. And what is all the tech, that we have, and, in a professional way, show where you can save money. This is an exercise that I did in a prior org, and it turned out, the head of IT had no idea we had 2 instances of Monday, and we had Road Monk, and we had Smartsheet. So we basically had 4 contracts that we were paying for 4 different project management tools. And so it was really easy to say, like, here's 100 grand right here. And I worked with all the teams, and we consolidated, to one platform. It was a little painful, because we had to, get alignment on which one, and those things. But, nobody could justify that it made any sort of logical sense to have, and then even two, like, somebody had one on their like corporate credit
Oh
card
my gosh,
that
the
was
corporate
billing a
credit
team
cards.
edition. And then someone had a
And it just happens, right? It's not like no one was doing something. They were doing things that probably made sense at
right,
the time. They didn't have a procurement function. They
right.
didn't have this. I remember I
Yep.
joined one organization, and my manager of a navelant said, I'm like, oh, well, they asked, they're like, oh, Anne, this renewal of X technology is coming up. I'm like, okay, well, who's the signatory authority? And they said, what? I'm like, the person who signed it. They're like, oh, that was me. I was like, I'm pretty sure you don't have, how much is this renewal for? And it was like for over $10,000. I'm like, we have an updated
Mm.
policy, but it hadn't flown back. And she's like, oh, I could just sign it. I'm like, no, 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 you cannot sign that.
Nope.
I can't even sign it. This has to go up. But it's okay. She wasn't doing anything wrong. That didn't
Right.
exist when they
Right.
procured this. And then the company just
Right.
grew and accelerated so much. And then we were just trying to catch up. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's how those challenges, and then down the road they create friction in, handoff processes, and those are one of my, the things that I frustrates me a lot is, having these handoffs between systems and people and process, and I think that's where revenue operations should really focus. And I really hate the term handoff. It's like I'd love to just call it, anything else but
Yeah.
handoff, like make something up, because to me it feels like, if you're the customer, here we're going to pass the baton, and then, we're
Mhm.
done, and then, they feel that. So I don't know if you've had experience, cleaning up any handoff process between marketing and sales, or sales to, project management or implementation
Yes.
or customer success. Do you have anything that comes to mind?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think you talk about kind of the experience it creates from a customer perspective of
Mm-hmm.
the handoff, right? But I think it happens internally as well. Well, I did my job, it's marketing's job now. I feel like
Mm-hmm.
it's not mine. And so I want to come back to something a little bit philosophical that I like
Mm-hmm.
deeply believe in. And so whenever I have a RevOps team or any team that I join, I kind of establish like a credo, like a handbook by which we're going to operate. And within that, usually it is aligned to the values of the company. I don't want to be like rogue and have my own values, but there are specific values that I really, really associate with high performing revenue teams. And in particular, high performing centralized operations, go to market operations, revenue operations team. And one of the top factors in that is accountability. And when I talk about accountability,
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, this is a non-negotiable. Like I expect this from
Right.
every single person in my team. What I tell them is, accountability is, yes, you take accountability for what you were going to do, but we're going to go a step deeper. I expect you, as part of your accountability, to know what comes before and after you're going to do. And so you're greasing the skids
Mm.
in both directions. And when you do that, and then this supports one of the other tenets, which is like, really, we operate as one team. It comes back to that woman I was telling you in marketing ops who was like so overloaded doing 90 hours a week. I exposed that in our sprint plan. I was like, we're taking these off of so and so's plate, we're moving them over. You have the capability. No one on our, or we're going to not do these things because we're just not going to do them anymore.
Right.
My decision. And then the things we have to do, we're going to reload this so that we can operate as one team. I've told my
Yeah.
team members, I'm like, do not ever come to me and never let me. There are certain things that, like, I'm like, you want to work whatever hours you need to work as long as you get your job done. You want to, like, take your kid to the doctor. Don't ever ask me that. Just take your kid to the
Yeah.
doctor.
Just do it.
You know, and the thing that I, as a non-negotiable, is do not ever say that's not my job. Do not ever say,
Right.
well, I pass it over to them and I don't know. I
Mm.
expect you to know. I expect you to
Yeah.
know. And that is part of partnership. And then as a result of that, like, mindset around accountability, I think for internally, it really helps. It doesn't feel like a handoff because it's a shared ownership, right? With
Mm-hmm.
respect to customer, I mean, the traditional handoffs that you would see, marketing funnel to sales funnel, how are we really managing that
Mm-hmm.
experience from a team perspective? If you have SDRs picking up the lead, really making sure we're being very tight, everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing, and what happens when they pass the AE, setting very, very clear standards of what is expected of both, if you have an SDR, what is expected of the seller, and holding both accountable. For example,
Mm-hmm.
if the SDR does everything according to the qualification methodology that we have established, and that AE does not accept, I'm not going to talk to the SDR, I'm talking to the AE, right? So we
Right.
hold them accountable to that. Sales to CS, things that we've implemented in past is, okay, we needed to make sure that we had a really, really strong handoff supporting customer experience.
Mm-hmm.
How do we get ahead of that, but not do too much work too early? Well, the moment that it hits a certain stage, boom, we send a notification to the CS team, head of CS. It's time to assign a CS leader or a CSM
Mm-hmm.
to this account. It's time to, trigger notification. This is in a late stage. Start to organize a kickoff. Both people are held accountable to attending, both AE and CSM, have a prep call in advance. And a lot of this can be facilitated through automation. And the result of that is
Mm-hmm.
a very seamless customer experience where the customer is not having to come in and catch the seller and the CSM up on what's happening. They've already done that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so critical, and doing it really well too can it can really help even close a deal, right? On
Mhm.
some of these enterprise deals where you're bringing in CS in that
Oh,
late
yeah,
stage and scheduling the kickoff call and making the introduction.
100%.
And I mean, those are just, it's so huge.
And I'm going to come back to this. I'll speak from my own experience as, you're a head of RevOps. You've bought, I imagine, and churned a lot of technology, as
Hmm.
have I. And I will share that as a result of an experience I had as a customer, as the economic buyer with a tool, with the CS team, it was the strongest launch, onboarding, and value planning exercise I had ever had as a buyer. I was so impressed by them. I referred them to multiple people. I let them, because they didn't have a Salesforce architect, I let them leverage some of our research to shape product. I then even went and joined that company later when I left. So it
Wow.
like paid dividends in terms of how they architected this really, really top notch customer experience and handoff.
Yeah, that's so important to for that longevity and for just really for everything and having it. Customer should never feel like they're experiencing a different process when it goes from sold to now they're implementing and they're becoming a customer.
Oh,
They shouldn't feel any different. They
and
shouldn't feel it at
you know
all.
it's happened. I mean, how many, and it's happened for companies with a lot of resources. One that will not be named,
Hmm.
but it might have gone viral in a post that I did last year. I mean, I had probably 4 different meetings before this was 2 or 3 companies ago, because we were unhappy with the experience. And I provided the feedback. They're like, we want to have a meeting with you, and we've invited X executive, and they're going to come and have a conversation. And then they came in and nobody had briefed them. And then I was like really annoyed as the customer. Can
Mm.
you all do your homework before you set an hour with me to talk about how you're going to turn this around so we can actually turn it around? We will do better. And the next one, they did it again. They did it again.
Wow.
I was so done. And for that,
Wow.
I just churned it. Like it was so bad. And
Yeah.
all it took was them talking to one another. And
Yeah, or listen to a recording, like just like even if you can't talk to them, listen to the last recording. Hopefully it's there, right?
this is almost where I feel like in that case, they had so many cooks in the kitchen,
Mm,
nobody knew who was accountable. Right.
yeah.
And so like they just kept bringing somebody in and repeating the same mistake. And it's
Hmm.
inexcusable. And this is like over $1 billion company, public company, completely inexcusable.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's where the mapping out the customer journey and who is back to a racy chart, who is accountable for the customer at all times and who owns the relationship. So you have different roles. We've called it a deal team. So, who's on first on the deal team and who is the person who's accountable for scheduling the kickoff and those briefings. And I think that goes back to core fundamentals of being a RevOps leader is mapping out the customer journey from a process perspective first and getting all those stakeholders, whether or not they roll up in your organization, doesn't matter, running around to every stakeholder, okay, what do you do here? What should you do? And getting alignment on that is critical because then it's like, well, I don't know, she's supposed to do this, he's supposed to do that.
It's the
And,
most
you know,
critical, fundamental exercise I do in every org. Even if it exists, has it ever been connected? Is it old? Is it out of
mm-hmm,
date? Do people know about it? Has it been socialized? So, I mean,
mm-hmm.
even I'm like, oh, you have a sales process? Okay. Do they know about it? Has the customer team seen it? Have they given input? So I'll usually be like, we're going to do a refresh of it. And then I've gone into orgs where I'm like, what about post sale? And they're like, what do you mean post sale? I'm like, well, where's the process? They're like, they don't have one. They have no, a
Yeah.
renewal comes up 3 months before we reach out to them. I'm like, your host. No wonder your TRR is out of
Yeah,
whack,
you're
right?
done.
So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's crazy. That's crazy. So, you mentioned enablement a couple times. I wanted to just drill down on that just for a minute before we wrap up. You mentioned enablement as one of your
Mhm.
pillars, and I think in your world, enablement is part of revenue operations. So, what is your opinion on that? Because I think a lot of companies have enablement in different
Mhm.
areas and there's a lot of enablement groups as well.
Yes.
So what are your thoughts in general around enablement?
Yeah, and here's the thing. I've had Enablement be a part of my org multiple times, and
Hmm.
I've had it be a partner org where it fed into a
Hmm.
VP and we partnered very closely. And I think it can make sense again based on where you're at in your go-to-market journey and your
Yeah.
maturity curve, right? If you get to a point where enablement isn't just, typically starts as sales enablement, and we're like, oh, we need
Hmm.
customers and CS enablement. I personally think it should be go to market enablement, where you are
Hmm.
responsible for streamline comms across centralized management. When I was in an organization, just documentation sat everywhere. It was in a G drive. It was completely disorganized. And I remember originally people like, we need to just organize the G drive. And I'm like,
Right.
what's going to be the face for the G drive? How are
Right.
going to people know like where's like the map? And so
Right.
what we ended up doing is, and we just did this like ourselves. So we organized the G drive, but the person who was responsible for organizing the G drive of all the curated content, teams could have their own folders. I wasn't going to manage their team
Yeah.
folders, but curated specific knowledge that everybody needed to make sure was the latest and greatest was managed via enablement. They were the only ones who could touch and move things into folders. The map in terms of like, hierarchy of knowledge all sat on one Notion page. And then we had a Slack group called like the Hub. We called this all the Hub. And
Hmm.
everybody knew that if you had a question about go to market, if you needed training, you went to the Hub. First, you went and you looked in the Hub navigation to see if it was there. And then if it didn't exist, then you could ask a question, you could submit a ticket. So by doing this, the knowledge one absorption just was so much stronger. People knew they were
Mm.
working the latest and greatest. They didn't have some old pitch deck that hadn't improved, etc. That was really really key. I think though when you get beyond sales and CS and suddenly you have like partner teams, right?
Hmm.
Customer enablement. Now it's becoming a really big function. And I'm normally
Yeah.
reaches that size. I'm like, I mean, I could do it if you like I can manage that, but you're gonna need an actual head. Am I a head of enablement?
Yeah.
Have I ever run enablement work? Is that my expertise area? No, it's not. Do I know fantastic enablement leaders I would absolutely bring in and
Right.
coach them up to a point, and then maybe they get to a stage where we're peers because they
Yep.
have so much, like you said, span of control. It needs to split off.
Hmm.
Great. But then we're very much tight at the hip, you know?
Yeah.
And so again, like I think though that enablement is such a critical function, and why I like it initially in RevOps is I'm like, well, we're building out the strategy, and then we're building out the process to support the strategy. We're building out, the technology as a foundational element as well, and then we're running the business. But oftentimes when I think about this whole flow, enablement is like, do people know about it? And are they providing feedback to it? And are we iterating? And is our voice on the ground and ears on the ground? Because sometimes the people that are doing the operating and doing the process, doing the systems are not getting that feedback. So I rely
Right.
on enablement. It's not that these people cannot, but to really be the voice of the go to market team, helping shape that. So we're always thinking the mind of our internal customer.
That makes sense, and it's really a mindset enablement. So wherever it sits, I think RevOps needs to have that mindset is how, because ultimately all of the folks that are going to use the materials, whether it's marketing, sales, a project management team or customer success, they need to be able to find it. They need to have it at their fingertips. It needs to be consumable, shareable. They need to be trained on it. All these things. So I think I like how you use the term partnership. Wherever it sits, I think it's the responsibility of both of those leaders to make sure it is a partnership, particularly when it comes to, all of the materials and tech and rolling things out. It has to be a joint process.
Absolutely. And I'll bring up one more, product marketing and enablement, probably one of the strongest partnerships that exists, right? And I mean,
Hmm.
I've worked with many CMOs and product marketing leaders, and they're just like generating so much content, battle cards, this, new pitch decks, but what they often need is, well, what's coming from sales or what's coming
Hmm.
from our customers and what are you hearing? And they just can't like develop all this stuff and be there. Maybe they're watching gong calls. And so enablement is bringing that. They're like, well, I'm sitting on the forecast calls and I'm listening to these and I'm pulling and I'm curating and consolidating all of that. And then I'm getting that over to you. And then they're developing the content. And then the head of enablement is like, okay, hopefully I like hiring former sellers to be a head of enablement
Hmm.
or or customer success professionals because they think in the mind of those individuals, what's going to work, what are their objections going to be, and so they can bake that into, now I have this great piece of content, how am I going to deliver that and get people to actually use it? And so that relationship's so key. And when we've had that, really, again, Racy very clearly defined, what does product marketing do, what does enablement do, the efficiency with us to be able to like distribute, create new content, distribute it, get it using, get feedback so much faster.
Yeah, that feedback is so important. Well, this has been a lot of fun. I'm sure we could go on for probably another hour, but I would love for you to leave our listeners, particularly people that are, looking to develop their career in revenue operations, maybe some tips, words of wisdom, before we sign off.
Sure. And also, Sandy, thank you so much for having me. I really look forward to the day when we can meet at one of these conferences
in person, and
have a hang. I think you're a big workout person as well, so we can do a workout. Tips. Okay, firstly, if you're looking for like, where do I go and find out? Well, come and join RevOps Village, the community that I run. Google group it. It's free. Anyone can join. It's not just for RevOps. I also have revenue professionals, sellers. Again, I'm a believer that like if sellers come and learn how to better sell to RevOps, it's a win-win, right?
Yeah.
So if you're in the revenue world or aspiring to, you can join. We do monthly webinars. That's one thing. A tip that I'm going to share, and I actually shared this with a revenue operations leader recently, in terms of, okay, if you want to kind of grow in your career and get up to like rise in the ranks, like, do I have to like be experts in all of these disciplines? No, you don't. I think pick within the pillars of RevOps, I named several of them, pick like 2 that you're really, really good at and know them so deeply that you can go all the way on the ground. So the people on the ground doing it, you can be at that level with them in the trench. And then you can pull up and anchor in those and then continue to build. So mine are like analytics is like a core of mine. I started in analytics. That's like the thread all the way through. And then I think like true, like understanding like operating cadence and cross-functional operating and getting teams to really align around that, it would be another one. So know those, invest deeply there. Maybe you're like, I really love systems and I want to learn that. And maybe you're like, what's a good complement to that? I would say analytics. How are people using those systems to make data-informed decisions? Or maybe you go to the complete opposite way. A lot of people that are really, really strong in systems, I'm not going to make a generalization, but maybe I will, sometimes struggle to think in the mind of the customer. Maybe you need to take a UX class or like go spend time with your sales team. So have 2 and really go deeply there, because I think like I see some leaders who get up here and can be all strategy. And when you come into a RevOps org as a new leader, usually it's a dumpster house on fire, right? And you have to just, as you know, like build process. You also have to get this team to trust you and want to work with you. And the way that I have done that is being able to meet them where they are in the trench and show them like, hey, I know that, or I know a couple of these. And then for the areas that I don't know, I'm gonna be like, that's why you're here. So you can teach me. And so those would be a couple tips I would say.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you're going into a Series A or Series B, you're going to be a one-woman operation in there. So you got to be able to dig in and get it done and build the process, build the system, and all the other things as you build out your organization. So that's great advice, great tips, and I just really appreciate you coming on the show and chit-chatting. And I'm sure we will chit-chat more. But thanks for joining today, Anne. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Sandy. Bye now.
All right. Okay, everyone. This has been another episode of RevOps Unboxed. Thank you for listening. This has been another episode of RevOps Unboxed in partnership with the Revenue Operations Alliance. Until next time, keep unboxing.